The year was 1947, and on the rain-soaked docks of Yokohama, a woman stepped off a battered transport ship, her worn kimono clinging to her thin frame, her face weathered beyond her 32 years. She carried nothing but a small cloth bundle and a leather-bound journal that had somehow survived everything. Around her, other women disembarked in silence, their eyes downcast, bracing themselves for what awaited on Japanese soil. These were the women who had lived near or in British military camps during the occupation, the women whose names would soon be whispered with disgust, whose mere presence would make neighbors cross the street, whose families would deny their existence. But this woman, Keiko Nakamura, was different in ways no one could possibly imagine. Before we dive into what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever heard stories from your own grandparents about the aftermath of war. Because what you're about to witness is not just a story of survival, it's a story about how one woman's unexpected confrontation with her entire community would expose the deepest wounds of a nation trying to rebuild itself on a foundation of shame. The importance of what happened in those post-war years cannot be overstated. Japan was a country on its knees, its cities reduced to ash, its pride shattered, its people starving and traumatized. And in that vacuum of devastation, society needed someone to blame, someone lower than themselves to make their own suffering feel more bearable. These women, who had simply tried to survive the unsurvivable, who had faced impossible choices between starvation and compromise, between death and dishonor as society would later define it, became the perfect scapegoats. They were labeled pan girls, comfort women for the enemy, traitors in women's skin. Their stories were erased, their humanity denied, their trauma compounded by the very people who should have embraced them. As fellow survivors, what you're about to hear is unlike anything history books dare to tell you. Because it challenges not just what happened, but who we believe deserves redemption, and who decides the measure of a person's worth. Keiko Nakamura had once been something the villagers of Kamakura would have celebrated. The daughter of a respected schoolteacher, she had been accepted to Tokyo Women's University before the war, one of only 3 women from her entire prefecture to achieve such an honor. She had studied literature and philosophy and had been engaged to marry a promising young doctor. But the war devours futures with an appetite that never sleens. Her fiancé died in the Philippines in 1944, his body never recovered. Her father died during the firebombing of Tokyo. Her mother succumbed to illness during the final year of occupation. And Keiko, alone and displaced, had worked as a translator for British forces stationed near Yokohama, because she spoke English, because she needed to eat, because survival is not a luxury but an instinct. She had never been a comfort woman in the way the cruel whispers would later claim, but in the moral arithmetic of post-war Japan, the distinction didn't matter. She had been near them, had spoken their language, had smiled when protocol required it. That was enough. Now, returning to Kamakura, to the village of her childhood, Keiko was about to face something far more brutal than anything she had endured during the occupation. The first act of disruption came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it would set the tone for everything that followed. As she walked through the village gates, wet from the rain, her wooden geta sandals clicking against the stone path, she saw them, her former neighbors. Mrs. Tanaka, who had taught her to arrange flowers as a child. Mr. Yoshida, who had been her father's closest friend. Young mothers who had once been her classmates. They all turned away. Not just looked away, but physically. Turned their backs, as if her very presence was a contamination. But Keiko did not lower her eyes. She did not rush past. Instead, she stopped in the center of the village square, beneath the ancient cherry tree that had witnessed generations. And she did something that shattered the unspoken rule of shame-bearing in Japanese society. She bowed deeply, formally, in greeting, forcing acknowledgement, forcing them to either return the gesture or publicly violate the most sacred of social contracts. The silence was deafening. Rain dripped from the temple eaves. Somewhere, a child's voice was hushed by a panicked mother. This woman, this impure woman, was demanding respect through the very traditions they claimed to uphold. The antagonists in this story were not monsters, but something more insidious. Ordinary people weaponizing collective judgment. The first to break the silence was Councilman Ito, a portly man in his 60s who had somehow emerged from the war with his property and influence intact, a fact that invited its own quiet questions. He stepped forward, his face contorted with performative disgust, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Nakamura-san," he said, using her family name without the courtesy of her given name, a deliberate insult. You dare to return here? You dare to stand beneath this tree where decent people gather? Have you no shame? Do you not understand that your presence here is an insult to every family who lost sons to the enemy? You serviced. The word he used, serviced, was carefully chosen for maximum damage, its implications clear to everyone present. Keiko remained still, her hands folded, her breathing steady. She had learned something during those years of occupation that these people, safe in their illusions of moral purity, could never understand. True strength is not the absence of fear, but the discipline of composure in the face of it. Behind Councilman Ito emerged others, each representing a different facet of the community's judgment. Mrs. Sato, a widow whose husband had died at Okinawa, her grief having curdled into bitterness. She needed someone to hate more than she needed healing, and Keiko was a convenient target. My husband died protecting Japan from barbarians, she spat, her voice breaking. And you? You survived by spreading your legs for them. How dare you come back here and pretend you belong? Then there was Reverend Kimura from the local Buddhist temple, a younger man who had been too young for war service and had filled the void by becoming the village's moral arbiter. His antagonism was more subtle, more dangerous, cloaked in religious language. Karma has marked you, he intoned, his voice soft but cutting. Your suffering is just the natural consequence of your choices. To welcome you back would be to endorse your path, to tell our daughters that honor is negotiable. And finally there were the young men, teenagers and men in their early 20s who had returned from war broken and angry, their masculinity in tatters, their futures uncertain. They formed a small cluster, their hostility more visceral, more threatening. One of them, Takeshi, shouted, "You made us look weak. You showed the enemy that Japanese women have no loyalty. You're worse than the bombers." Each accusation was a blade designed to cut differently. Councilman Ito represented institutional rejection, the bureaucratic denial of her basic rights as a citizen. Mrs. Sato embodied personal grief weaponized against the wrong target. Reverend Kimura offered spiritual condemnation, suggesting even the universe itself had judged her. And the young men threatened physical consequences, the promise that shame could escalate into violence. The crowd that had gathered, perhaps 60 or 70 villagers, watched this orchestrated attack with a mixture of righteous satisfaction and uncomfortable uncertainty. Keiko stood at the center, absorbing it all, and when the cacophony finally subsided into expectant silence, she spoke. Her voice was clear, educated, steady. It was not the voice they expected from someone who was supposed to grovel. "Councilman Ito," she said, using his full title with perfect formality. "You ask if I have shame. Let me answer by asking you a question. What is the difference between shame and guilt?" The crowd shifted, confused. This was not how this was supposed to go. She continued, addressing each antagonist in turn, her words measured and surgical. "Shame is what others place upon you. Guilt is what you carry for your own actions. I have no guilt for surviving, but I do wonder about those who assign shame so freely. Tell me, Councilman, where were you during the firebombings of Tokyo? Where were you when women and children burned in the streets?" The tension was palpable. Several people gasped. You did not question a councilman's war record, not in public, not ever. But Keiko's tone was not accusatory. It was simply questioning, seeking truth. Ito's face flushed red. I was needed here, to manage local affairs, to coordinate, to survive," Keiko finished gently. "As we all did, each in our own way, under impossibly cruel circumstances." She turned to Mrs. Sato. "Sato-san, your husband's death is a tragedy that cannot be measured or compared. Your grief is real and deserves honor. But I wonder, does directing your pain toward me truly ease it, or does it simply give it a temporary target?" Mrs. Sato's face crumpled, anger mixing with confusion and something that might have been recognition. To Reverend Kimura, Keiko said, "You speak of karma, of consequences. But whose karma, I wonder? The woman who translated documents to feed herself, or the society that offers her no path to redemption? Buddha taught compassion as the highest virtue. Is this compassion?" Her words were landing like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread through the crowd. But the young men were not moved by philosophy. Takeshi stepped forward aggressively. "Words! Just words! You think you can talk your way out of what you are? You think we don't know what you did?" The crowd tensed. Violence seemed to crackle in the air like static before lightning. This was the first peak of tension. The moment when the confrontation could turn from verbal to physical, when the mob's energy could crystallize into something irreversible. Keiko turned to face him fully, and for the first time her composure showed. A crack, not of fear, but of something deeper. When she spoke, her voice carried an edge of steel wrapped in sorrow. Tell me, Takeshi-kun, what do you think I did? Please describe for everyone here exactly what you believe my crimes to be. The young man faltered, his bravado meeting specificity. You were with the British soldiers. Everyone knows. I translated requisition forms, Keiko said clearly. I helped prevent misunderstandings that would have led to arrests or violence against villagers who didn't understand what was being demanded of them. I was never forced into any arrangement, though I watched other women face that choice daily. Women with children to feed, women whose alternative was starvation, women whose courage and sacrifice you spit on because it offends your pride. The silence that followed was different now, less certain, more fragmented. Reverend Kimura tried to regain control of the narrative. Even so, there are proper ways to survive, to maintain dignity even in hardship. And here Keiko did something unexpected. She laughed, not mockingly but with genuine bitter amusement that shocked everyone. Dignity, she repeated. Shall I tell you about dignity, Reverend? Shall I tell you what I saw? Women who killed themselves to maintain this dignity you speak of, leaving their children orphaned. Children who starved because their mothers refused to accept help from the enemy, even as their bones showed through their skin. Men who beat their wives for crimes of survival that the men themselves were too broken or too proud to prevent. Is that the dignity you're defending? The dignity of death over compromise? The dignity of judgment over mercy? The crowd was fracturing now, some nodding despite themselves, others doubling down on their condemnation. But the monolith of collective judgment was developing cracks. This is when the first revelation began to surface, slowly, like dawn breaking over the horizon. An older woman, bent with age, pushed through the crowd. It was Grandmother Ochi, a widow who commanded respect through sheer longevity and the old authority of the matriarchs. Nakamura Keiko, she said, her voice reedy but firm. I remember you as a child. I remember your father. Before you speak more, before these people judge you further, I want to know, that journal you carry, is that your father's? Keiko's hand moved unconsciously to the leather-bound book tucked into her obi. You recognize it? Your father and I corresponded about educational philosophy for many years. That journal was his pride. How did you come to carry it? This was not the question anyone expected. The crowd leaned in despite themselves. Keiko's eyes, which had remained dry through all the accusations, suddenly glistened. When the firebombing came, my father was at the school. He knew he would not escape. But he went back inside the burning building to save one thing. His writings. His philosophies on education. On raising children to think critically, to value truth over comfort, to practice compassion even toward those we disagree with. He gave this journal to a student who was fleeing and asked that if they survived, they find me and give it to me. 2 years later, that student, burned beyond recognition, showed up at the camp where I was working. She had walked from Tokyo. She had kept this journal safe through everything. She died the next day of her injuries. The crowd was utterly still now. This was not the story of the shameful woman. This was something else. Councilman Ito, desperate to regain control, tried to interrupt. This is all very tragic. But it doesn't change. Let her finish, Grandmother Ochi commanded, her voice carrying the weight that only the very old can wield. You wanted to know about shame. You wanted to judge her life. Then let her speak it fully. Keiko nodded gratefully and continued, her voice stronger now. My father's final entry in this journal, written the morning before the bombing, says this. If Japan is to survive its defeat, it will not be through clinging to the past, but through the courage to forgive ourselves and each other. We will all have to make impossible choices. Judge each other not by the choices themselves, but by whether we remained human through the choosing. She looked directly at Reverend Kimura. You speak of karma, of divine judgment. My father, who was more Buddhist than you will ever be, who spent his life teaching the Dharma to children, believed that survival itself was sacred, that maintaining one's humanity in inhumane circumstances was the highest form of practice. The second revelation came from an unexpected quarter. A middle-aged man stepped forward from the back of the crowd, well-dressed despite the hard times, his bearing suggesting education and authority. Nakamura-san, he said formally. Do you remember me? I am Suzuki Takehiko. I was one of your father's students, 15 years ago. Keiko. Studied him, recognition dawning. Suzuki-kun? The boy who wanted to be a doctor? I am a doctor now. I serve at the hospital in Yokohama, and I need to tell these people something they don't know. He turned to address the crowd. 3 months ago, a British soldier came to our hospital, dying of infection. He had no money, no way to pay. We would have turned him away, but a woman came with him, a Japanese woman who had served as a translator. She begged us to help him. She offered to work in the hospital without pay to cover his treatment. That woman was Nakamura-san. I recognized her immediately. Do you know why this soldier was in Japan? He had stayed behind, against orders, searching for Japanese children who had been orphaned, trying to reunite them with family members. He had become ill doing this work, and Nakamura-san had spent weeks helping him, using her own resources, her own network of contacts among other disgraced women, to find these lost children. The crowd erupted, in confused murmurs. This didn't fit the narrative. Councilman Ito looked panicked. That's irrelevant to the question of her wartime behavior. Dr. Suzuki's voice turned cold. Is it? Because I think it reveals character in a way your judgment cannot. How many children have you helped reunite with their families, Councilman? How many orphans have you fed? But the revelations were not finished. From her cloth bundle, Keiko pulled out several worn letters, their paper thin from age and handling. These are letters, she said softly, from families of soldiers, both Japanese and British. During the occupation, I wrote letters for soldiers who were illiterate or couldn't express themselves well. I wrote letters home for Japanese workers, explaining to their families why they couldn't return yet, sending what little money they could. I wrote letters for British soldiers to their mothers, their wives. I wrote letters of condolence when soldiers on both sides died, helping families understand what had happened to their sons. She held up one particular letter. This one is from the mother of a Japanese soldier who died at Iwo Jima. She wanted to thank the woman who had written to her explaining that her son had died bravely, that his last words were of her. She didn't know that woman was me. She didn't know that the British officer who told me this story did so because I had helped him write to his own mother about the horror of what he had witnessed, and, in his grief, he shared stories of Japanese courage. Mrs. Sato, the bitter widow, was visibly shaken. You wrote letters of condolence? For our soldiers? For any soldier whose story I knew and whose family needed to hear it. War does not stop grief from being grief, no matter whose side bore it. Keiko's voice was gentle but firm. I could not bring your husband back, Sato-san, but I helped 37 other wives understand how their husbands died, and I made sure they knew their men were remembered with honor. Mrs. Sato began to cry. Not the bitter tears of anger, but the released tears of grief finally acknowledged. The transformation was beginning, but the climax was still building. Reverend Kimura, perhaps sensing that the moral high ground was eroding beneath him, made one final attempt to reassert the narrative of shame. These are fine deeds, if true, but they do not erase the fundamental question of purity. Our traditions, our culture demands certain things from women. You were in proximity to enemy soldiers, you spoke their language, you made yourself available to them in ways that compromise your fitness to rejoin our society. Even if your actions were noble in some ways, the taint remains. This is simply how things are. And here, the final, most unexpected revelation emerged. Keiko reached into her obi and pulled out a small, worn card. It was an official document, stamped and signed. Reverend Kimura, she said, her voice now carrying an edge of something that might have been anger, might have been triumph, might have been sorrow for the lesson about to be taught. Do you know what this is? The Reverend squinted at it. It appears to be some kind of military identification. It's a commendation, Keiko said clearly. From the Allied Intelligence Service. During the occupation, I provided information that prevented 3 planned acts of violent resistance that would have resulted in massacres of civilians. Japanese civilians. Your civilians. Groups of young men, traumatized and radicalized, were planning to attack Allied checkpoints in ways that would have triggered overwhelming retaliation against entire neighborhoods. I intercepted their communications, I informed the authorities, and I personally convinced 2 of the groups to stand down by explaining the consequences to their families and communities. This document acknowledges that my actions saved an estimated 300 to 500 Japanese lives, civilian lives, in the immediate post-war period. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute. It was as if the entire village had collectively inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Councilman Ito's face had gone from red to pale, his authority crumbling visibly. The young men, including Takeshi, looked stricken, the simplicity of their hatred meeting the complexity of reality. Grandmother Ochi began to laugh, a dry crackling sound like autumn leaves. "So," she said to the crowd, "this is the shameful woman you sought to drive out? A woman who lost everything, endured everything, and still saved your lives without you even knowing it?" Dr. Suzuki added his voice. "There's more. Nakamura-san, tell them about the medical supplies." Keiko hesitated, then relented. During the occupation, medical supplies were severely limited. The Allied forces had more than they needed. Japanese hospitals had almost nothing. I negotiated for supplies to be lost from Allied inventories and found their way to Japanese hospitals. It was technically theft. It was probably treason against the occupying forces, but children were dying of treatable infections. Women were dying in childbirth for lack of basic sanitation supplies. So yes, I stole. I manipulated. I used whatever limited influence and access I had. Judge me for that if you must. But judgment was the furthest thing from the crowd's collective mind now. People were looking at each other, the scaffolding of their righteous condemnation collapsing piece by piece. The turning point had arrived, multifaceted and devastating to the original narrative. Takeshi, the young man who had been most aggressive, sank to his knees. His voice, when it came, was broken. My sister lived because the hospital had antiseptic last year. She had an infection after childbirth. They said she would die. But then the hospital suddenly had supplies, and she lived. Was that because of you?" Keiko looked at him with infinite gentleness. "I don't know which supplies reached which hospital. I only know I tried." The young man pressed his forehead to the muddy ground, the traditional gesture of profound apology. I called you unspeakable things. I threatened you. And you saved my sister's life?" Mrs. Sato was weeping openly now, her grief no longer seeking a target but simply expressing itself in its raw form. She approached Keiko slowly, hesitantly, and then bowed deeply, formally. "Nakamura-san, I have been so angry, so lost in my anger. I needed someone to blame, and you were there, and I thought if I could hate you enough, it would make his death mean something. But all I've done is dishonor his memory by becoming cruel. Please forgive me." Keiko reached out and raised the older woman by her shoulders, a gesture that was both compassionate and subtly assertive, establishing that forgiveness was hers to give or withhold. "Sato-san, your grief is valid. Your anger is understandable. War destroys us in so many ways, not just physically. It makes us into people we never thought we'd become. I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because we both deserve to be free of this bitterness." Councilman Ito, his political instincts warring with his dawning shame, tried once more to salvage something. "These revelations are certainly significant, but the fact remains that rules were broken, proprieties ignored, and lives were saved." "Grandmother," Ochi interrupted sharply. "While you sat here, safe and comfortable, managing your local affairs, this woman was in hell, making impossible choices to protect people who would later spit on her. You want to speak of propriety? Let's speak of it. The propriety of a community that cannibalizes its own survivors to feel better about themselves. The propriety of men who judge women for surviving the wars those same men started and lost. Perhaps it's time we examined which rules serve life and which ones serve only our pride." The old woman's words landed like judgments from a higher court. Reverend Kimura's transformation was perhaps the most visible. He approached Keiko slowly and then did something unprecedented for a religious authority figure in that time and place. He prostrated himself completely, the full formal apology reserved for the gravest of errors. "Nakamura-san," he said, his voice muffled against the ground. "I spoke of karma with arrogance and ignorance. I used the Buddha's teaching as a weapon when they are meant to be a path to wisdom and compassion. I judged you through the lens of my own cowardice, my own need to feel morally superior because I had never been tested as you were tested. I ask not for your forgiveness because I have not earned it. I ask only that you allow me to learn from this shame I now feel, to use it as you suggest, not as a stone placed upon you by others, but as a teacher that shows me my own failings." Keiko looked down at him, and for the first time her composure fully cracked. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Reverend, stand up, please. If we are all going to heal, we must stop prostrating ourselves before each other and start standing together. The resolution began to take shape as the rain finally stopped, as if even the weather recognized a shift in the emotional landscape. Keiko addressed the assembled villagers, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak truth. I did not return to Kamakura seeking vengeance or even vindication. I returned because this is my home. These streets hold my childhood, my parents' memory, my history. I returned because I refuse to accept that survival requires exile, that endurance demands perpetual punishment. I returned because I believe we, as a people, as a community, can be better than our worst impulses. But I cannot do this alone. And more importantly, neither can you. She turned to Dr. Suzuki. You mentioned you serve at the Yokohama hospital. They need translators, don't they? For the few remaining allied personnel and the international aid workers. The doctor nodded. Desperately. We struggle constantly with miscommunication, with patients who can't explain their symptoms. With medical techniques, we need to learn from foreign doctors. Then I offer my services, free of charge, for as long as you need them. And I know at least 15 other women, all like me, all tainted by their contact with the occupation forces, all of whom speak English, some who speak other languages, women who have been cast out, who are struggling, who have skills that are desperately needed. Let me organize them. Let us contribute to the healing of our country, even if our country still rejects us. To the young men, Takeshi and his friends, she offered something different. You returned from war to find your futures uncertain, your masculinity questioned, your place in society unstable. That anger you feel is valid. But it's misdirected. I propose something. There is work to be done rebuilding our country that requires strength, requires courage, requires the kind of discipline that soldiers understand. Infrastructure, construction, community organization. Let me help connect you with opportunities where your skills are needed. Let me help you channel your strength toward building rather than destroying. And in return, I ask that you help protect other women who are returning, who are vulnerable, who need to be shown that there are men in Japan who understand that strength includes protection, not predation. The young men, Takeshi among them, nodded, their hostility transformed into something that might, with time, become purposeful energy. To Mrs. Sato and the other widows and mothers who had lost so much, Keiko offered perhaps the most meaningful gift. I still have letters, dozens of letters, from soldiers and about soldiers. Stories of courage, of final words, of small kindnesses in the midst of horror. I have carried these stories because I believed someone needed to remember them, to honor them, to ensure they weren't lost in the chaos of defeat and occupation. I would like to organize a memorial, a place where these stories can be told, where families can come and understand what happened to their loved ones, where grief can be expressed and honored without shame or silence. But I need your help. I need the families who understand loss to help me create this space. Will you help me? Mrs. Sato, tears still streaming, nodded vigorously. Yes, I will. It would be an honor. To Councilman Ito and the village leadership, Keiko's offer was more pointed, carrying the sharp edge of a lesson. You have authority in this village. You make decisions about who is welcomed and who is cast out. I ask you now to make a different decision. There are dozens of women like me in the surrounding areas. Women who are homeless, who are destitute, who are suffering, because their communities have rejected them. I am asking you to establish a shelter, a place where these women can come to be safe, to be fed, to be given a chance to rebuild their lives with dignity. I will help fund it with the money I've saved from my translation work. I will help staff it, but I need the community's official support. I need you to make a public statement that these women are welcome, that their survival is not their crime, that Kamakura will be a place of healing, not continued punishment. Can you do that, Councilman? Can you find the courage to lead in a way that serves life rather than pride? Ito, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, looked around at the crowd, at the faces of people who were watching him to see what he would do with this moment. Finally, he nodded slowly. Yes, we can do that. We should do that. Grandmother Ochi smiled, showing gaps where teeth once were. Perhaps there is hope for you yet, Ito-san. The atmosphere in the square had completely transformed. What had begun as a public shaming had become something else entirely. A community confronting its own capacity for cruelty and choosing, however imperfectly, to turn toward compassion instead. People began to approach Keiko, one by one, some to apologize, some to thank her, some simply to acknowledge her humanity in a way they had refused to do before. The ancient cherry tree, witness to generations of the village's joys and sorrows, stood sentinel over this moment of collective transformation. As the crowd began to disperse, some to their homes, some clustering in small groups to process what had happened, Keiko stood with Grandmother Ochi and Dr. Suzuki. The old woman placed a weathered hand on Keiko's shoulder. "You know, child, what you did today was more dangerous than anything you faced during the war. You challenged not just a few individuals, but an entire system of thinking. You forced mirrors into the faces of people who had very comfortable lies. That takes a courage of a different kind." Keiko smiled tiredly. "I think I was just tired of being afraid. Tired of carrying shame that wasn't mine to carry. When you survive the unsurvivable, you realize that the opinions of others, however painful, cannot kill you. Only your acceptance of their judgment can do that." Dr. Suzuki added, "What you've started here, it won't be easy. There will be resistance, backlash. Some will never accept that they were wrong. Some will resent you for forcing them to confront their own behavior." "I know," Keiko replied. "But that's not my burden to carry. I offered truth. I offered forgiveness where I could, and I offered a path forward. What people do with that is their choice, their karma, as the Reverend would say. I can't control whether they take it. I can only control whether I remain true to what I know is right." Over the following weeks and months, the shelter was established in an old merchant's house near the village edge. Women began to arrive, tentatively at first, hardly believing that a place of refuge existed. Keiko and the other women worked together, some as translators for the hospital and international aid organizations, some as teachers helping to rebuild the education system, some as craftswomen preserving traditional arts that might otherwise have been lost in the chaos of modernization. The memorial to the fallen soldiers was completed 6 months later, a simple garden with a wall where families could write the names of their lost loved ones and share their stories. It became a place not of nationalist glorification, but of honest grief and remembrance, acknowledging the complexity of war and the humanity of those who fought and died.